Hey folks, Sean here, and in this episode, I want to talk about a topic that doesn't get as much coverage as it should when it comes to the work we do in building our SaaS businesses, and that's branding, which has heavy influence on your marketing efforts. And in particular, I want to focus on naming. This is an area where I feel like people just get a ton of bad advice and run with these ideas that get them into trouble further down the road. Now, there's two kind of hilarious examples, but I want to start with the worst one. And that's a recent branding naming change that it's borderline infamous at this point in terms of how bad it is and how poorly received it has been by their user base and their customers. That's HBO. If you're unfamiliar with HBO, you've probably been living under a rock because they are wildly popular media production company, create a ton of shows, videos, movies, all that kind of stuff. And they've been providing the service for decades, right? So I'm sure you're familiar, at least in passing, with HBO. But more recently, they have followed a journey in rebranding the name of their service, their company, from HBO to HBO Max. And then the last step, which perplexed everyone, they dropped the name HBO and they just kept Max, which creates a whole bunch of problems. Now, HBO is the name that was always synonymous with like the highest level of quality, impressive production, really impressive media in terms of shows and movies and stuff like that. In particular, it was the shows, like The Sopranos, more recent stuff like the Chernobyl Diaries they're critically acclaimed. They've received all kinds of awards. So they have a brand and a lot of goodwill that is very strong. They've created a ton of loyal customers over a long period of time. So the name HBO is like Coca-Cola to the soda industry, so to speak, the beverage industry. Now, when they made this change, I'll speak from my own personal experience. I have a smart TV or like a Roku that plugs into a TV and makes it smarter. And on it, you can install and run apps. And I have apps for streaming services. One day, I was accessing my whatever HBO Max or my HBO app, and the next, I couldn't find it. I just assumed that it was gone or it had been uninstalled or whatever. I stopped using it because I'm like, oh, I guess I lost access or something. Long story short, come to find out that the app was still there. It was installed. It was just now referred to as Max, which did not have HBO in the name at all. So I had no idea that the two of those were affiliated. And I saw a post online recently that talked about some of the biggest branding naming disasters ever. And one of the most popular options that came up in that post was this HBO change. Okay, so why am I sharing this with you? It's because it really is important that, from my perspective, you leverage all of the advantages that you can. Right now, a company like HBO has got seemingly unlimited budget to do what it is they want to do, but they still made a huge mistake here, and it's still causing a lot of problems. Besides the bad reputation points that they're now getting and dropping a name that they spent so much time and effort building over such a long period of time. Anyway, I could talk about that for days. But other stuff that you might see out there. I just recently rewatched an HBO series called Silicon Valley. And on that show, they talk about naming. They talk about companies like Uber and Hooli, which is the fictitious name that they have representing big tech in the show. But they talk about how the names are supposed to be these like ambiguously worded, just like bizarre things that, when said out loud, sound very different than almost anything else you've ever heard. There's also a very interesting joke in the show. So if you play that episode, you'll get what I mean there. But that is a unicorn thing. That's a VC-backed startup thing. That's where when you blow up or as you approach that crazy status, people have those wacky names. And many of them are not what I think is, by and large, the best way to name anything. And that is thematic, which is the strategy that I'm always leveraging. And the reason why I create thematic names, I'll give you examples, is because marketing is hard. If you haven't done a lot of marketing before, it's difficult, especially if you're creating something new. If you're trying to get people to understand your software, what it does, how it helps them, and you create some kind of bizarre name, like Uber, then you're going to need to spend a fortune convincing people or associating Uber with transportation because it doesn't have anything like that in the name, right? Instead, if you leverage the thematic name, I'll give you an example of mine, which is called Podcast Show Notes. Now, if you had to try to figure out what it was that tool did, what would your guess be? That tool creates podcast show notes, right? So it even speaks to the output, a little bit about the outcome that I'm creating for my users and customers. And I could tell you that having both that name and having both that domain is helping me tremendously when it comes to people finding my product, especially the people that need help with what my product does. And if the name of my product matches what my product does, then I have about as efficient as you can get transition from people looking for solutions to finding something that they think can help. So this is to say that when you're thinking about naming or you're doing any rebranding, I highly encourage you to create a name that is thematic or that helps your users, your customers, your prospects understand what it is your product does. That will only help you. And the further removed you are from that, the more challenging this is going to be for you. It could cause problems later down the road. I don't know if you'll ever make it or I will ever make it to a level like HBO has, but even with all their resources and experts and budget, they still made that huge blunder. And they lost a name that had a lot of goodwill, had a lot of recognition, and they changed it to something that way back in the day was associated when I was a lot younger with Cinemax, which is like, they did like softcore porn basically, which I can't think of any association that they could have wanted to have less than being referred to as Cinemax. I've literally heard people tell me that it's like that's what they think of when they think of Max. They definitely don't think of HBO. So don't make those mistakes. Do your best to come up with thematic naming. Trust me, it will help you when it comes to marketing and storytelling for your product.